Hi everyone and welcome to the internet. What we're going to be doing in today's lesson is having a look at two types of reproduction. So we're going to look at sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. So hopefully by the end of this lesson you're going to be able to describe those two types of reproduction and explain the differences between them. To start us off, we've got a couple of questions based around our previous lesson, so have a go at answering those in your book for me. Let's mark those answers then. So our first one, the two types of variation that we get are continuous for one mark and discontinuous for the second mark. In terms of our causes of variation and their examples in question 2, you get a mark for saying genetic, and the example for genetic you could have had eye colour, blood type, any number of others there. So 1 mark for the cause, 1 mark for the example. You could have had environmental, and a correct example there, so scars, tattoos, piercings, etc. And for the genetic and environmental combined, you could have also had examples like height, intelligence, and so forth. So give yourself a mark out of 8 based around your scores there. Now what I would like you to do is, in your books, write me down a definition for what a clone actually is. When we're talking about a clone, what we're referring to is an organism that is genetically identical to its parent. And this is one of those key definitions that you really need to know almost word for word. So what we're going to be looking for in any question that asks you what is a clone, then it's something that is genetically identical to its parent. So make sure you've got that phrase written in your books. Now the pictures I've included on screen here, these aren't just cute animal pictures just for the fun of it, they're actually all cloned animals. Now one you've probably heard of is Dolly the sheep, who you can see just towards the left hand side there. so cloned in Edinburgh many years ago now. But there have been a wide range of other animals that we've also cloned around the world. So what we've got in the top left there is Cumelina, the little mouse there. In the bottom left then we've got Noto and Cargo, which are two cows that were cloned. We've then got the cat there, you can see, that is Copycat. We've got the dog, which is Snuppy, and you can see Snuppy there is the puppy with its actual cloned version, or the adult of the cloned version next to it. And then on the far right we have Tetra the monkey. So all of those animals you can see there are creatures that we have actually cloned ourselves in a lab. Now, the reason that we talk about cloning at this point is because when we're referring to asexual reproduction, then we're going to produce clones as a result of this process. And a good example of an organism that uses this process naturally to produce their little offspring are bacteria. So bacteria reproduce asexually, without sex, and what we then find is that every offspring from that parent cell will be genetically identical to it. So what they're actually doing is using a process that we've already looked at in an earlier biology topic of mitosis. So write down those 3 sentences and then see if you can answer the question at the bottom to explain the process of mitosis. Let's see who can remember that from our earlier biology topic. Let's double check to make sure we all remember what mitosis is and how it happens. So, process of mitosis is how we're going to make identical cells to the parent. The first step is the DNA unzips or unwinds. Second stage is that the free bases then pair up with their complementary base pairs. So that's A's with T's and C's with G's. So pointy letters go together and curly letters go together. The chromosomes then line up along the equator of the cell, and remember we've got twice the number of them because we've just duplicated them in the previous step. What then happens is those spindle fibres pull the chromosomes to the opposite poles of the cell, and then the cell divides by that process of cytokinesis. So the cell membrane pinches in and then the whole cell divides, and it then grows after that. So obviously give yourself a mark for any of those 5 points that you've got, and give yourself a mark out of 5. If you added the extra detail like cytokinesis, etc., then that's really good. So bacteria are one example of an organism that uses asexual reproduction in order to reproduce, but we've got a number of plants that also use asexual reproduction. Now, some of these you'll be quite familiar with, I'm sure. So if you think about the vast majority of science labs, then they've probably got spider plants sitting in the corner. And from those spider plants, which are the ones in the bottom left of your screen there, you get those runners coming off with teeny tiny little spider plants on them, the little plantlets. And the same thing happens with strawberries as well. If you happen to have any strawberries growing in your garden, then what you find is you get those runners coming off with those little plantlets, also genetically identical to the parent plant. We then have our potatoes, and they use a system called a tuber. Now, the tubers are actually the potatoes themselves, the bits we eat. So if you take those and then you plant them in the ground, you will grow another potato plant with more potatoes on it. So we will then produce lots of genetically identical copies. And then the one that we haven't talked about are daffodils, which use bulbs. So what we've got there are a range of different plants that are using asexual reproduction. And they've got slightly different methods for it, either bulbs, tubers, or the runners with their little plantlets on there, but all using asexual reproduction. So jot those examples down in your book if you haven't already. You might be sitting there thinking, okay, so bacteria and plants, but animals, they won't do this. They'll use sexual reproduction. And yes, sure, they do in a number of cases, but we do have some animals that also use asexual reproduction. And two of these examples are in the pictures you can see at the bottom there. So the first one is the starfish. So hopefully we know what a starfish is. It's the one in the bottom right there. It's a creature that looks kind of like a star with various points depending on which particular species we've got there. And we've also got the sea anemones. So the bit that Nemo hides in Finding Nemo, those sea anemones also reproduce using asexual reproduction. And you can see them in the bottom left corner there, conveniently with a little clownfish there too. Not that I spent ages just hanging around the anemones trying to find a clownfish in an anemone just for this picture. Of course I wouldn't have done such a thing. The second type of reproduction we've got is sexual reproduction. Now, in order to actually carry out sexual reproduction, we need two parents. So that's our first key difference there. Asexual, you only need one parent. Sexual, we need two parents. And what we end up with as the end result of sexual reproduction is genetic variation. And the reason for that is that we're going to have some of the DNA in our offspring coming from each of the two parents. And it's sexual reproduction that the vast majority of animals use. So even where we've got the same two parents, then what we'll find in the offspring is they're not all identical. And I'm sure if you think of some siblings that you know, then you can look at them and think, well, there's some similarities there, but it's quite clear they're individuals. And I've given you the example there of Prince William and Prince Harry. So what we see, two parents, and we then get genetic variation due to the DNA coming from both parents. So make sure you've got those 3 points written down in your book. So a scientific word that we need to know and use properly is the word gamete. Now a gamete is a sex cell. So see if you can finish off that second sentence for me about the names of those sex cells or the gametes in humans. Hopefully what we identified is that in humans the sex cells are the sperm and the egg. Now as long as you've got those two written in, the order of them doesn't matter, so give yourself a tick for each one you got right. Obviously if you didn't, make sure you've written them in so you do know that in humans our gametes are the sperm cell and the egg cell. What I'd like you to do now then is, on the screen there are 5 sentences and we've got 4 missing words. So I'd like you to write those sentences in your book and see if you can fill in the blanks using the words in the red box at the bottom of your screen. So have a go at doing that for me. let's double check those answers then. Obviously, make sure you tick any you got right and correct any you got wrong. So egg cells are made in the ovaries, sperm cells are made in the testes. So what we find is that obviously females will have ovaries and they will make our egg cells, whereas the males will have the testes, which make the sperm cells. And in the case of both the egg cells and the sperm cells, those gametes are made by meiosis. Now do go careful with the spelling of that because it's really similar to mitosis in many ways and gets mixed up an awful lot, and your spelling will matter on the exam for this. The gametes are haploid, and the word haploid there just tells us that they've got half the number of chromosomes of a normal body cell. And again, this is one of those really common questions that they used to love, is that they give you a random animal, so they tell you something like a polar bear has 24 chromosomes in a normal body cell. How many chromosomes are present in an egg cell? And all we need to do is, because the gamete, so the egg cell, is haploid, we just divide the number of chromosomes in the body cell by 2 to get half the number. So you can do that, or we could do the inverse and work out the number of chromosomes in a body cell if we're told the number in a gamete, just by multiplying it by 2. So haploid just means they've got half the number of chromosomes of a normal body cell. Next thing I'd like you to have a go at doing is explain what happens in the process of fertilization, including why the offspring has unique features. So we don't need to worry about the initial part of the sperm and the egg actually kind of, getting into the same body. That's really not the detail we're looking for here. What we're looking at is the sperm and the egg are in one body. How do we actually get the process of fertilization occurring? So what we've got here is about as complete an answer as I could think of for what you might have written for the process of fertilization. So give yourself a mark for any of these points. A sperm cell meets the egg cell, hopefully you all got that one, in the fallopian tube. The sperm uses the acrosome to digest part of the membrane of the egg to allow the head of the sperm to enter the egg, where the two nuclei fuse. So that covers the process of fertilization. And in terms of why we get these unique features in the offspring, what we see is this is a completely random process. Out of all the millions of sperm that are in that single sample, then only one of them, if that, will make it to fertilize the egg. And again, that egg is at random released from the ovaries. You've got all those different eggs there, only one of them has reached maturity and been released at that point, usually anyway. So what we then find is that out of the many millions of sperm and all of those eggs, one random sperm meets one random egg, and the combination of DNA in each of those is unique. And that's why we get those unique features. But it's not just animals that use sexual reproduction. Plants also use sexual reproduction. Now, the way that they do this is they do still have a male and a female gamete. So in the case of our plants, the male gamete is the pollen and the egg cell is the female gamete. And what happens is the pollen is transferred from one plant to another, and it then fuses with the egg cell to produce a seed. And that seed will then grow into the new plant. So the picture at the bottom I've given you there, in the middle is hopefully something that looks familiar from your earlier science lessons about how plants fertilise. So the pollen grain is on the top, we get the tube growing down, and the nucleus then travels down into the ovary where it then fertilises. On the left are just some lovely zoomed in microscope images of different types of pollen, and on the right just a range of different seeds that we've got there. So the last bit we really need to look at today then is a comparison between sexual and asexual reproduction. So what we've got in this little table then, I've summarised it down into the kind of pros and cons if you like, so the positives and the negatives. So anything that's positive is the green background, and anything that's slightly more of a negative side to it, that's got the pinkish background there. So if we look at asexual reproduction first of all, then what we find is if we've got a parent that is well adapted to the environment, then the offspring will be too. Because remember, the offspring is an identical genetic copy of that parent cell. So if one's well adapted, then the rest will all be well adapted too. So that's a good thing. For our sexual reproduction, I've put there a positive of variation leading to adaptations. And you might think, well, that's just the opposite to what we've just said as being a benefit. We've said that everything being the same is positive, which, yes, in some situations is true, but if we then experience an environmental change, if everything is identical, then they will all be wiped out by the same thing if they're susceptible to it. So by having variation, we can adapt those changes and some will survive. And we'll look at this in more detail as we go further on through our genetics topic. Back to the asexual for another benefit, we only need one parent, which means reproduction can happen at a much faster rate. So in the case of bacteria, they can reproduce every few minutes. So incredibly quick compared to obviously us as humans, where it takes about 9 months to get a baby there. In terms of a downside or a negative for asexual, then as we've just mentioned, a change in one of these biotic or abiotic factors may destroy the species, because if they're all identical to one another, they're all susceptible to the same things. And in terms of a downside for sexual reproduction, then because we need two parents, reproduction is going to be much slower. Just look at the giant panda for an example. There they really are the prime example of a creature that, as far as I'm concerned, really is too stupid to live, and there's a whole slew of reasons why. But one of those reasons is that their reproduction is painfully slow. For a start, there are two parents needed because it is sexual reproduction, and they are solitary animals. Therefore, that panda has to try and find another panda, and bear in mind that they spend many hours a day, so probably about 15 to 16 hours a day, just eating bamboo to stay alive. So the thought of them actually moving to find another panda in the limited areas they have left is pretty far-fetched, hence why they're pretty endangered. So, much slower to reproduce using sexual reproduction compared to the asexual, which is much faster because only one parent is needed. Last point that we really should note is that we do have some organisms that are playing the best of both worlds. So something like the sea anemone, for example, can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So they're taking the best of both worlds to maximise their ability to therefore survive. Make sure you've got that table written down, highlighting which ones are positives, which ones are negatives, and the fact that there are some of these organisms that will use both sexual and asexual reproduction. I'll leave this up for about another minute or so in case you haven't already got it written down. Last thing to do today then are the plenary questions. So those who are target grades up to grade 5, 2 columns on the left. Those who are target grades over a grade 5, 2 columns on the right. So I'll leave this up for about 3 minutes, but as always, if you need longer, hit pause and take as long as you need to answer these in your books properly.